So these days, digital cameras have so many different settings that it can be pretty overwhelming. And over the years, I've really learned the Sony system well, but when I picked up this new Fuji X100VI, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed. There were a lot of new settings, and a lot of the same settings have different names, and so I was kind of lost, and it took me a while to figure everything out. So I'm not going to be able to cover every setting in the menu in this video, but I will tell you how my camera is set up for the way I like to shoot, and some little tips and tricks and settings that I've learned that will hopefully give you a little bit of a head start if you're trying to set up this camera. So before we get into the settings, I want to go over a few tips and tricks that I've learned that just help you navigate the camera a little more efficiently. When you're in the menu system on this camera, you can actually use the front and rear scroll wheel to get around. And once you get used to that, it's a lot faster than using the joystick on the back. So the front scroll wheel will take you through pages in the menu system, and the rear scroll wheel will scroll through individual menu items, and then you can actually push that wheel sort of like a button, and it will open up that menu item so you can make changes to your settings. Another thing to note is that some of the buttons on this camera have functions when you press them and when you hold them. So this little front lever here, I have it set so that when I just push the lever, it will change my viewfinder from the optical viewfinder to the EVF. But then if I hold that lever, it will activate the built-in ND filter in this lens, so that's super useful. On the back, the menu button obviously takes you to the menu with a quick press, but if you hold it, it will lock all your buttons and settings so you don't actually change stuff while you're shooting. And then you hold it again to unlock. Play button doesn't have a second function. The display button down at the very bottom, if you hold that, it'll take you to your function menu where you can edit what all these buttons do. So that's easy if you don't want to dig through the menus to find it. And then the little Q menu button, a press will take you to your Q menu where you can store some of your favorite settings. And then if you hold it, it will take you to the edit Q menu section so you can change what you have in that menu. So those will just kind of help you get around the camera a little faster, and especially when you're setting your camera up and you're changing what those function buttons do, it's kind of a pain to dig through the menu over and over. You can just hold that display and back button. So for me, this camera is my everyday carry camera, and a lot of times I just have full auto settings. So the aperture ring's set to A, and then the ISO and the shutter speed are set to auto. And in here, I have an ISO range set so that the camera goes all the way to the minimum up to about 6400. I don't want it going above that. And that's how I shoot most of the time. If I need to control my depth of field or my shutter speed, then I can always switch to manual settings. And if you're new to photography, I recommend you learn how to shoot on manual before trusting the camera to go full auto. So if things aren't working out right, at least you know why, and you can manually set the settings that you want. So as I'm shooting, I typically use the EVF viewfinder for most of my photos. Sometimes I like using the optical, but I have this little lever set to switch between the two. Just with a quick tap, it'll switch between the EVF and the optical. Again, mentioned this earlier, but if you hold it, it turns on the built-in ND inside here. This little center button inside that lever, I have set to pull up my custom settings. Custom settings are basically different film profiles that you can build into the camera. It includes a film simulation, and then settings like clarity and contrast and all the stuff that you use to build a Fujifilm recipe. So using that little button on front, it pulls up a menu, and then I can just cycle through all the recipes that I have saved in here. Next up, this little tiny FN1 function button to the right of the shutter. In normal shooting, I have it set to view mode. So a lot of times I'll have this set on eye sensor. So the screen will be on when I'm shooting with the camera away from me, and if I pull it to my eye, it'll turn off the screen and pull up the little viewfinder. But sometimes if I want to conserve battery, I'll cycle through those view modes and turn off the rear LCD so that it's only in the viewfinder display. And then this button also has a separate function. If you go into the menus, under Setup, Button Dial Setting, and on page 3, you'll see a little Playback FN1 button setting. In that setting, I have it set to Smartphone Transfer Order. And basically what that means is when I'm in playback mode and I'm reviewing my photos, if I hit that little button, I get a message that says Transfer Ordered, and then I can hit it again to cancel that transfer order. But I can move through a bunch of photos, and any one that I like, I hit that little button and it'll say Transfer Order. And then once I have all those images selected, I turn the camera off, and on my phone, I open up the Fuji X app, and it'll say transfer order awaiting from Fuji. And I just click on that little message, and it'll move all those photos that I selected on the camera over to my phone, And that's just a super easy way to transfer images and then share them. I can text them or airdrop them to my friends or whatever I'm doing, post them on Instagram. So that's a really cool feature for that button. On the back, I have my auto exposure lock button set to just lock exposure, not focus. That way, when I'm shooting, I can find an exposure I like, I can lock it in place, and if I need to move to focus on a different part of the frame, that comes in handy. So for focusing on this camera, I have my autofocus set to tracking, and I pretty much always shoot continuous autofocus. I found that the focus on this camera is actually really good. Not quite as good as my Sony setup, but pretty close, and I don't really miss shots all that much, so I've just trusted continuous autofocus since I've had the camera. So this little joystick on the back, I have under setup, button dial setting, page 1, focus lever setting. I have it set so that when you push in the joystick as a button, it recenters your autofocus point, and then when you move the joystick, it'll move that point around the frame to whatever you want to track, and then you start autofocusing and it'll track it. And then you can always reset it right to center easily. So that kind of covers all of the external buttons. If I didn't mention ones, it's probably because I just left them as their default setting. One thing I forgot to mention is that I've only shot on the X100VI. So if you have an older model, it might be missing some of these buttons or some of these settings. When you open the menu system, at the top of the menu is your image quality settings. And these are the settings that you use to build out different recipes, and then you save them in the custom settings section. And that's how you have recipes on the camera. The X100VI can store 7 different ones. I have a different video planned for recipes and some of the favorite ones that I like to shoot with. If you want to see that, leave me a comment below, let me know. Skipping over some of those settings, I'm not going to get into recipes here, but if you scroll down to page 3 called Auto Update Custom Setting, I have this set to disable. Basically what this will do is after you build out a recipe, if you go in there and start to change things, it will automatically save those changes. And I found that it kind of messed up my recipes if I was just experimenting and didn't want to save it. So you can still go in there and change stuff, but when you turn the camera off, it'll delete those changes. I kind of find that handy for keeping the recipes that I have set in there, set the way they are. And then based on my shooting scenario, if I need to change my white balance or something like that, that setting will stay as long as the camera is on. But then if I finish up shooting indoors and I turn the camera off, it'll reset my white balance setting. So when I'm back to shooting outside, everything looks good again. If you have that set to disable, it's not going to save those recipe changes. But as you can make all your changes, and once your recipe's set, there's a setting right above that called Edit/Save Custom Setting. And that's where you would go to overwrite a custom preset with all your changes. And you'd also go in there to rename your presets so that your custom settings, your recipes have names. And the recipes I have are built to mimic films, so I just have the custom setting named for that film stock. So the next major thing to set up is your Q menu. And this is just a smaller menu of items that you don't really need enough to set them to a custom function button, but they're menu items you want to access semi-regularly instead of digging through the whole main menu system. These can be whatever you want, and these will change based on your shooting style. One of my Q menu items is this Kelvin setting, and some of my favorite recipes I have built based off of a Kelvin white balance. So this lets me easily change the white balance of the recipe, and since I have that auto save setting disabled, when I turn the camera off, all those settings will reset, so I'm not gonna mess up my recipes. But if I need to change something on the fly, if I'm shooting in weird light indoors, I can make that change and just leave the camera on and shoot, and then when I turn it off, I'm back to normal. So I know I only covered a fraction of the settings in this camera. Whenever I get a new system, honestly, I just put on a show that I've seen a ton, like The Office or Seinfeld, and I just go through the menu, one item at a time, figure out what each thing does. Sometimes I have to look them up online, and it sucks, but it really is the best way to learn a new menu system and kind of start to get it set up the way you want. And then you just learn over the first few weeks that you're shooting what you really need to be readily available. You program those to your function buttons, you put other items in the Q menu, and then over time you kind of have a camera that just feels like an extension of you and not this piece of tech that you're always battling with. So that's something I'd recommend, to learn settings that I did not go over here. I think that's all I got for you. I hope this is helpful. If there's settings that you're confused about or you have questions on, please put them in the comments below and I'll try to answer. But I've also noticed a lot of people online have their own ways to use this camera, and they might chime in and give some good answers or do do things differently than the way I do them. So get a conversation going down below, and I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Thanks.